Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining Harvard Alumni for Global Development for the Leaders in Global Development series, a speaker series, featuring Joshua Sear, founder and CEO of Empower. My name is Muska Fazlat, and I'm honored to moderate this discussion today. Before we begin, we would like to go over some housekeeping notes to be mindful of throughout the session. Audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the program, so please feel free to use the chat box below to input any questions you may have. You're also welcome to engage with the event's participants using the same chat box below. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available to view after the event. We will share the details with you on how to view the recording following the discussion. Also, please be sure to stay tuned with our group on social media and on our website in the chat box below to stay up to date with upcoming events and workshops throughout the remainder of the year. All right, we're about to dive in, but first, I would like to learn more about our audience in the chat box below. Let us know where in the world are you joining us from. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why? And what inspires you to be a part of global development? Let's see some of those answers. Welcome. So we have someone from France. Lovely. DC. Oh, dinner with Cleopatra. That would be amazing. Nigeria. Wow. Amsterdam. Wow, we have everyone from all over the world. That's amazing. Toronto. Well, nice to meet you all. Japan. Wow. It's a lovely time to be there. Okay. So now let's begin now. And now it's my honor to introduce our guest, Mr. Joshua Sear. He is the founder and CEO of Empower, a software company described by the New York Times as Uber's rival. Prior to founding Empower, Mr. Sear was a senior counsel at SageNet, a large managed network and cybersecurity services provider. Before then, Josh gained M&A experience, first as a counsel for Matterhorn Transactions, a legal tech startup, and then as an associate at a boutique transactional law firm. Prior to practicing law, Josh worked in the Obama White House and for the Senate Judiciary Committee. He is a graduate of the George Washington University Law School and the University of Virginia, where he was an Echols Scholar. Mr. Sears, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Muska. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I always like to begin with just the beginning. So before founding Empower and working at the White House, you were a young man with big ambitions to succeed in some capacity. Talk to us about how your upbringing got you to where you are today.
Sure. I guess, I grew up in the South in Atlanta. Both my parents were doctors. In fact, my mom still practices. They, from the early age, sort of instilled in me a pretty good work ethic. And also, the importance of, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, doing good, and making the fact that, I came from I think a relatively privileged background, taking advantage of that and giving back, and not wasting the opportunities that I've been fortunate enough to have. So, I think that's really shaped me in a lot of ways. With parents who are physicians, just you're sort of surrounded by folks who are looking to help people, and I think that has has a lot to do with why I created this company.
That's lovely. Good to know. Can you talk to our audience more about what Empower is and what a day-to-day is like for you leading the company? How do you manage that constant influx of news surrounding the gig economy in Washington?
Sure. Well, I guess high level Empower, is a software company, as you mentioned. We flipped Uber's business model on its head, and we've created a company where the drivers are the customer, where they have the ability to run their own business, and we provide them with the software and support services to do that, as opposed to working on behalf of a company like Uber or Lyft. So with Empower, our software allows them, they set their own rates, they get 100% of the fare, they're provided with support services, and other technical and other support services that are just geared to helping them truly run their own business. I think Uber and Lyft sort of suggested, particularly early on, and maybe even to this day, that, with their companies, drivers are working for themselves and have all this freedom. And while they may have some freedom with respect to their schedule, the reality is they work on behalf of Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft set the rates. Uber and Lyft collect money from riders. Uber and Lyft pay drivers for providing rides to Uber and Lyft's customers. And that is a very different business model from one in which drivers are truly working for themselves, like with Empower, and drivers with Empower are paying us for our software and support services. And as a result of that business model, we found that drivers are making considerably more money. They also feel better. They feel listened to because the customer. When I started this company, I was hearing from tons of drivers about how not only were they not making enough money working for Uber and for Lyft, but they just felt like those companies really weren't listening to them, didn't care that much about their opinions. And with Empower, they're the customer. We get 100% of our revenue from their subscription fees. And so, we like to tell them, at the end of the day, you don't have to trust us. If we don't provide you with a level of service that you're willing to pay for, we're going to go out of business. And so we need to listen to you as our customers. And I think that's really resonated with them. In terms of the day-to-day, it's putting out a lot of fires. I think that's one of the challenges of any startup, is that there's a lot of things going on between dealing with employees who do work for the company, dealing with the product and improving it, raising capital, dealing with legal issues. And as a lawyer, fortunately, I have some, or maybe unfortunately, I have some familiarity with that and I'm more involved in that. So it's just, I think that the biggest, challenge is balancing the things that get thrown at you that you don't realize are going to be thrown at you every single morning, every day, and still making sure that there's enough time to focus on the higher level strategic initiatives that the company needs to pursue in order to continue to grow.
That's lovely. I love the fact that the company has a driver-first model, and always putting the drivers first in terms of compensation for their work. What were the biggest surprises you encountered when raising capital for Empower, and what advice would you give to founders preparing for their first institutional pitch?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, at least as it comes to for me. I would say I think I was surprised to find that venture capitalists are much more risk averse than I anticipated. To a very large degree, I think they have there's a perception that they're making a lot of bets on a lot of different companies and that they take a lot of chances. I haven't found that quite so much to be the case. I think the other thing that I was a bit surprised about, maybe not surprised about, but that I found to very much be the case is that institutional investors are incredibly sector driven. And they are much more trend followers than trend setters. So, and that makes a lot of sense when you think about how they are judged, right? They are compared to their peers. So right now, obviously, there's a gazillion companies, AI companies coming about, right? And if you're a VC and you invest in an AI startup that fails, no one's probably going to blame you or have any problem with it. On the other hand, if you as a firm don't invest in AI and everybody else is, and AI ends up being as big as everyone thinks it's going to be, everyone's going to wonder what in the heck you were doing, right? So, there's a lot of more trend following, and that changes, almost year to year. I mean, at one point it was blockchain and crypto, pharma, biotech. There was a point in time when it was mobility. But I think that's been, I don't know so much as a surprise, but to the extent that exists and how strong of an influence the sector is, it was I guess a bit of a surprise. In terms of suggestions to folks who are pitching institutional investors, I guess a lot of that depends on what stage you're at. If you're talking about their first pitch and you're early on, you should definitely, and it also depends on how much money you're looking to raise and what type of business you have, but you should, ideally, have some data, some metrics, some results to show. There's not a lot of institutional investors that are going to invest money just based off of your idea, unless perhaps you've already, founded a company and been successful. Then they may be more apt to back someone that's got a track record. But so you should have a product, you should have a business model that's very fleshed out, you should know who your customer is, and you should have some data to back up, your contention as to why they should be investing in your company. I think, some other things to note is you should definitely cast a very wide net. Once you get one or two folks interested, you'll probably get a lot of folks interested. Because again, there is a bit of a trend following. Getting that first person to be interested, I think, is probably the most difficult part.
Lovely. You emphasized Empower's driver first model. What does that look like in real terms compared to Uber or Lyft, as well as what has been the major trade-off of the driver first model?
Yeah. So, as I said before, I mean, with Uber and Lyft, their customer is the rider. And they've really, for a while, they kind of tried to sort of suggest otherwise, but I think they've now embraced the fact that their customer is the rider. They're providing rides to those riders. They set the rates, they charge riders, and then they pay drivers. And the amount they pay drivers is no longer in any real way connected to the amount that riders are charged. They, as a business, might try and charge an individual rider as much as they can for a given ride. And that might differ between two people who are standing right next to each other, on the same block, based off of the data that they have. And at the same time, on the driver's side, they send dispatches and requests, to drivers, and they indicate how much they're going to pay those drivers, and it is not based at all on what the rider is going to be paying for that fare. And it can differ based on which driver they send it to and based on the data they have as to what that driver is willing to accept in order to provide that ride. Empower's business model, we don't provide rides. We provide software to folks who do want to provide rides and who want to run their own business. And as such, the drivers are our customer. I like to liken it in many ways to, Expedia, or OpenTable. OpenTable doesn't provide meal services. OpenTable provides software services and booking services and other payment services to entities, whether it is a big restaurant or even a little hole in the wall that's owned by a sole proprietor. They provide them with software services, and their customer is the restaurant owner, not the restaurant goer. And likewise with Expedia, their customer is the airline or the hotel chain, not the passenger or the person staying in a hotel. So I think it's while on the outside looking in, it may seem like, oh, there's an app, I request a ride. Maybe it's not that different, but it is a fundamentally different business And, in terms of some of I think you asked about the drawbacks or some of the challenges. I mean, one of the challenges is that, with Empower, the drivers all set their own rates. So, providing riders with estimates as to what the rate may ultimately be is a bit more challenging because, we don't know which driver is ultimately going to accept the ride request. Now, of course, we have lots of data and we know what all the drivers are charging and we can, use that to provide a pretty good estimate, but that's a challenge. And, with a much more decentralized platform, we don't have as much control. We don't have quite as much control over the rider experience either. Just like OpenTable doesn't have that much control over the dining experience of people who are booking their dinner reservations through OpenTable. And so that can, of course, pose some challenges, particularly for riders who might be used to a certain level of uniformity. And they might be used to having a big company being the customer of that company as opposed to being the customer of the individual service provider who's providing them with their transportation services.
Makes sense. How do you respond to critics who argue that the gig economy workers, even on Empower, still lack basic worker protection?
Yeah, I mean, we've gone kind of the opposite end, right? And so drivers, they're not our employees. They're not even our independent contractors. We don't pay drivers. They're our customers. We don't provide them with any types of benefits whatsoever, other than our software and our services, and which effectively is the ability for them to run their own business and make considerably more money than they would working for Uber and Lyft. And with that additional income, we found that the drivers are able to purchase other things that they may need that they can't afford otherwise, working on behalf of Uber or Lyft. So I come at sort of from a different perspective. We want to Empower is for drivers, quote, gig workers who want to actually work for themselves, right? I think the problem with Uber and Lyft is that, Uber and Lyft kind of claim that they get to work for themselves and provide and don't really provide them with much in terms of benefits, but at the same time, they actually don't provide them the freedom of working for yourself, which includes the ability to set how much you want to charge for your own services. I've never heard of anyone who works for themselves that can't determine how much they want to charge for the services that they provide, or that has to accept and provide certain services to a certain number of people who request them. And so I think that, if you're somebody who's looking for, certain benefits that are provided by an employer, well, Empower, driving for, using Empower software probably doesn't make a lot of sense for you. If you're someone, though, who wants the flexibility and want to work for yourself and truly want to work for yourself and be your own boss, and as a result of which make more money than you might otherwise working for somebody else providing transportation services, then I think Empower is an opportunity, and it can afford you with additional income that can allow you to purchase those other services or needs that you may have. And ultimately, we want to sell those other things to drivers. So while I don't imagine we're going to sell health insurance, there may be other insurance products or financial service products that may be important to drivers that they may want and that they can't get, where we may be able to ultimately sell those services at prices that are very competitive to our customers.
Thank you for explaining that. At what moment you realize Empower could take on established giants such as Uber and Lyft?
That's a good question. I think as a founder, if you don't have a lot of confidence in yourself and in the business that you're creating and in your vision and in your product, then you're probably maybe in the wrong line of work, and you're probably not going to be that successful. So pretty early on, I felt pretty confident. I saw, and even frankly, before we created the product, I saw back in 2018, I felt that Uber and Lyft's business model was fundamentally broken. I saw that Uber and Lyft were losing amounts of money that were unprecedented. And I was not buying the argument that after over a decade, that these companies, despite being a duopoly and Uber being in countries all over the world and them controlling 100% market share effectively in the United States, that the issue with the reason why these companies weren't yet making money was because they weren't fully scaled, and that they were just choosing to lose money at the rates that they were losing money. And so I thought that the business model was flawed. I thought the concept of a nationwide, let alone global transportation service had a lot of problems. It's an incredibly low margin business, and it's regulated all over in every state differently, in every country differently, and trying to centralize that, I thought had a lot of problems. And so from the very beginning, I thought that there was an opportunity here. And then I think one other thing, and this came from my legal background, Uber and Lyft had this big problem where, they didn't want the drivers to be classified as employees. That would be catastrophic to their business model. They'd lose even more money than they were. At least that's their belief. And as such, that limits the amount of control they can have over these folks. So basically, they built this enormous driver base, but they did absolutely nothing to protect it, and they really can't. I mean, can you imagine, if you are, a Google or Apple or any major company, and basically you've got this big group of people who ostensibly work for you, and they can go work for anybody else, and you kind of have to go out of your way to make sure that they can do that, or work for themselves. Right. And I thought that was going to be a big problem for those companies, that there wasn't really a moat. There wasn't a barrier to entry other than the fact that they had raised huge amounts of money. But at the end of the day, that's not a sustainable moat. And so from the very beginning, I thought that this would make a lot of sense. And then I guess one final point I'll make is I went and talked to a ton of drivers after I came up with the idea. And every single driver, I mean, almost without exception, was very displeased, to put it mildly, with the status quo. And they felt like they weren't making enough money. They felt like they weren't being heard, and they all wanted to know how quickly software could be built that would allow them to work for themselves. So when I started hearing that, I felt pretty confident. And the only thing that I needed to see was whether or not riders would be willing to request those rides. And we quickly learned that they were.
That's great. What surprised you most about your job? Anything you expected differently before entering the sector you're in?
I don't know if there's anything specific with respect to the sector. I would say that I guess one thing that surprised me, and this kind of relates back to raising money and investors, is in the beginning when you're raising some money, typically maybe from maybe it's friends and family, maybe it's high net worth individuals, might not be institutional money. People sort of, you might have a lot of confidence that your business is going to compete with Uber, but, and they like the idea of that. But I think most people in the beginning, when they're investing in a startup, realize, I'm probably going to lose all my money. Interestingly, once the business starts to grow and folks start to realize, hey, wait, this really could work, they actually become, they want more information. They push back more. They trust seemingly less, because all of a sudden they become no longer just optimistic. Oh, I might make tons and tons of money on this. But now they're fearful that they won't. They start to have an expectation they will. And when people become afraid, it causes them to do things that sometimes aren't the most productive in the world. And productive for the company. And so I guess I was a little surprised. I've been surprised by, as the company has become more and more successful, frankly, the more questions and pushback I got from investors who, 12 months, 24 months before were willing to write me a check with very little information. Now they're seeing this great success and this great growth, and the company's making money. And they have a lot, and they want more control or more say or more, they want to be heard even more, which is kind of an odd dynamic, but kind of makes sense.
Well, thank you for sharing that. My next question is, what do you see next for Empower? More cities? Do you see it having a global expansion on it? Where's the vision for the next 5 years?
Oh, 5 years is tough. I mean, I've learned that, frankly, more than anything over the last 5 years, is that, while you should certainly have a vision and a plan, maybe it's a 5-year plan, it should be a real loose plan, because so much can change. I mean, COVID is a perfect example. No one could have predicted that, or maybe somebody did. But, again, that just upends things. AI, you've got different administrations coming into, winning election. I mean, there's so many things that are unpredictable, that trying to really have a firm plan for 5 years, I think, is difficult. That being said, our focus right now is expanding into additional markets throughout the United States, growing the markets that we are in, continuing to improve the service offerings that we provide to our customers. Down the line, I think there are other verticals that we could enter. There are other services that are complementary to the services that we sell, that either we could sell or we expect to partner with other companies to sell to our customers. But right now, I think our focus, certainly over, the next 12 to 24 months, principally is launching more markets and growing the markets that we are in, because it's a tremendous opportunity. It's a huge market that Uber and Lyft have created. And I think that our business model just is a much better approach to solving the needs of consumers, of getting from point A to point B, and providing those that are providing those rides with a way in which they can do so sustainably and with some dignity and pride.
Well, we would love to see it being expanded to more cities and even globally. My next question is, how do you measure success beyond just the market shares?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's a lot of ways you can measure success in a company or in a startup in particular. Obviously, to the people who you work with every day, your employees and your coworkers, I mean, are they happy? Do they enjoy the work that they're doing? Are they compensated well, that they're able to, live comfortably enough? I think that's important. I think it's not just the dollars and cents. I mean, look, this is not a mission. This is not a charity, right? And I like to argue, I don't even think of it as a mission-driven company exactly, in the sense that, this is not, buy a pair of socks, give away a pair of socks, or buy a ride, we plant a tree. I mean, those are all nice, and companies that do that, that's great. But that being said, there still is I think, a very positive societal benefit to our business, in that we are empowering individuals, for lack of a better word, to run their own business, have greater control over their day-to-day and their financial future, to make more money, to have more money in their pockets, which, for these folks who are driving for a living, I mean, it makes a huge difference. An extra $1,000, $2,000 a month is a tremendous amount of money. It can make a tremendous difference in the lives of these individuals. And in some cases, it's meaningfully more than that. And then also, as a result of our business model, these drivers are also able to provide their services at a discount to what Uber and Lyft are charging, which is incredibly beneficial for a lot of people who don't have cars, who don't have otherwise access to affordable transportation services. We saw right from the beginning in the DC market that the bulk of the rides in the beginning that were being requested in the most historically underserved parts of DC. And so, that's something that I'm, proud of and happy to see, that not only is the company growing and profitable and able to employ more people, but that our customers are making more money, and that their customers are also saving money and being able to get a service that they need, that they might not otherwise be able to afford.
Very true. So Josh, they say that success comes with sacrifice. Do you find that you have a hard time balancing work and life? Does work-life balance even exist with how busy you are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that changes over time, or at least it can, with respect to any company and any startup. In the beginning, the first few years, I was working a ton. 80-hour work weeks, pretty much every week, was pretty regular. 100% of the time thinking about the business. I still work hard. I'm still working 50 plus hours every week. I'm still probably always a part of my brain that is at work. It's, pretty much impossible to turn that off. Part of that's just me, but part of that's also if you want to, upend Uber, a $150 billion market cap company, that has a lot of power. It requires that level of dedication. That being said, I have 3 kids, 9, almost 7 and turning 7 in a week and almost 5. And, I do make sure that I make time for them. Fortunately I work a mile from our office. I can walk if I want. So that's obviously very convenient. I try and make sure that I'm home to put them to bed, sing them their songs each night and every night. I spend time, with my oldest after dinner, who's now able to stay up a little bit later. Make sure I have time with my wife, make sure I keep in touch with, family and my close friends. So I think it's important to have, balance, but that balance is different for every person. I love what I do, so that makes it easier, right? If I didn't like what I did, this would be miserable. I feel very fortunate. I might be, there might be a week where I'm working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. But if you really enjoy the work you're doing, it doesn't feel so much like work. That being said, of course, family cares and they want time, from you. And so again, that's important to balance. And I think it's important, to live a healthy, balanced life, to have, and to take care of yourself too, physically and mentally.
Thank you for sharing that. Very important. And that, like you said, it depends on the individual in terms of work-life balance and how they would like to do that. Another question that I wanted to ask you was, what does it psychologically take to build a company designed to challenge like billion-dollar companies such as Uber and Lyft? How has the process of that?
Yeah, I think in part it depends on what you're building, what sector you're in. There's all sorts of we're not just taking on a company that's got a market cap of $150 billion. We're taking on all the politicians and regulators that they've developed relationships with over the last 15 years. And so that's doubly hard. So I certainly chose a difficult path. I think psychologically, you definitely have to be a person who maybe to some extent is a bit of a contrarian, doesn't take no, does maybe that are possible that other people think are not. You've got to be willing to put in a ton of time. You've got to be, I think, pretty thick-skinned. It certainly helps. And have it's important to listen. I think it's incredibly important to get advice and listen to people, particularly from folks who have experience that as a founder you don't have. And there's all sorts of things that I don't have experience in and want that advice. But at the end of the day, you have to make the decisions as the CEO of the company. And you've got to have conviction in your decisions, because if you don't feel confident in your decisions, it's going to be very hard to execute effectively on them. I think it's, again, important to get feedback from others, but at the end of the day, there may be times where 10 people who you really trust and think are really smart, think you should do it one way. But if you really feel like, no, I just know that this is the best path, right? You should know your business better than anybody else. And of course, respect what other people think and digest their opinions. But at the end of the day, you've got to be prepared to do what you think is the best thing for the company and not what maybe other people think is the best thing for the company, who don't know everything that you know, and don't have the experience that you have in building the company and running the company. And that takes a certain type of person. That's a very hard thing to do, because it's a lot easier to just kind of go with, all these people told me it must be the right thing. And by the way, if I'm wrong, they told me to do it. Right? Because if you're wrong and you don't listen to other people's advice, you certainly have no one other than yourself to blame. And some people aren't comfortable with that. But I think it's very helpful to be a person who's comfortable and okay making a mistake, being wrong, acknowledging that you're wrong, and it not shredding your ego and your confidence, right? I make mistakes. I make dozens of mistakes every day because I'm making hundreds of decisions. And so if I were to think less of my own abilities as a result of the fact that I get some of those decisions wrong, I'd be incapable of doing this job.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. What's one book, podcast, or resource that has influenced your professional journey?
I'll be honest, I don't really listen to podcasts. I don't know. I don't know. I don't really think that, I'll be honest with you. I don't think there really is one book or resource or podcast that's really influenced me. I think, I read a lot of different things. I don't get quite as much time to read these days as I used to. I've read a lot of, nonfiction and biographies of successful people. And you can take away a lot from that, right? I mean, you have to have your own path, but like to ignore the successes that other successful people have had is really foolish. And so, I wouldn't pick any one individual, book, but there are definitely a number of biographies that I've read that I think have been helpful and insightful.
That's great. Have you ever faced a career setback, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there've been plenty of them. I'm trying to think what would be a good example. I would say, well, maybe just with respect to this business and tying back, you asked some questions about raising capital. We raised some capital early on from some high net worth individuals. We've never really raised an institutional round. We made efforts to do so. Some of it was bad timing. Some of it was strategic, efforts by the incumbent to do everything they could to make it so that it would be more difficult for us to raise capital. And they have a lot of experience raising capital, having raised more than anybody else and knowing everybody in that space. But so that was difficult. And so, what we ultimately had to do was I built this business from the beginning, with an eye towards profitability. I didn't think that anybody really wanted to invest, tens of billions of dollars or even billions or even hundreds of millions in a company, that was just focused on top line like Uber and Lyft and didn't have ultimately a plan to profitability in something less than 15 years. And so that was always the case, but we were forced to sort of expedite that a little bit more. And we've grown the company organically. We haven't raised any capital, I think, since 2022. And the company is now increasingly profitable. We reinvest back into the business. It's growing. I mean, the top line has doubled in the last 4 months. And the bottom line has grown even more over that period of time as a percentage. And so, I think as a founder, as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, there's a lot of things that you need to be successful. I think the thing that served me best, and that is probably one of the most important things, is the ability to adapt, to be flexible, to take what comes at you, and to deal with it and work with it and move forward.
That's great. Before we open up questions for the audience, to ask, last question is, what advice can you give our audience who seek to jump into a world of entrepreneurship or tech or transportation sector?
Yeah, I'll focus on maybe the high level entrepreneurship. A few things. I mean, you really need to know who you are and be honest with yourself about who you are. You need to know how much time are you willing, if you're thinking of starting a company, how much time are you willing to devote to this and have it be a failure? How much of your own money are you willing, if any, to put into this? Can you afford to not take a salary? Can you afford to invest some of your own money? How comfortable are you asking friends and family, or strangers for that matter, for money if you think you're going to need to raise capital? Do you really want that level of responsibility? Because it's not just a responsibility to investors. You also have responsibility to ultimately, if you're fortunate enough to grow and hire employees, they depend on a paycheck, and also to your customers. Do you want that level? Because that's a lot of weight, And that's not for everybody. And then I think one other thing is, really be careful and think about, and it's hard to do at the end of the day because hindsight's 20/20. It's impossible to know. But I think the best way to think of it is think about what your values are and try and make sure that the people who you choose potentially to co-found a company with, I didn't have a co-founder. And I really wish I had one. It would have helped a lot. It just didn't work out that way. But so that's another thing to think about. But the people who you work with, the people who are potential co-founders, your potential investors, do their values, does their work ethic, does it align with yours? Right. And it's not to say that theirs is wrong and yours is right, but do they mesh up? Are they consistent? Because, and to be very transparent and have very open and honest conversations about those things as early as possible. Because otherwise it's going to come back to bite you one way or the other. And that's inevitable. It will happen no matter how open and honest conversations you are, because just, maybe the other people, not everybody is. And also not only that, things change. People's lives change. People's circumstances change. All of a sudden they're married and they have 2 kids. And when they started, they didn't have a spouse or any children. And that can very much fundamentally change someone's entire outlook on life and their priorities. So, things are going to change, but do everything. It's hard enough, to begin with. Do everything you can to minimize, the interpersonal conflicts if you can.
Thank you so much, Josh. Now we open up questions to the audience. Please feel free to use the raised hand button or type in your questions in chat. Give everybody a couple of moments. Go ahead, Monte.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Toronto, Canada, not necessarily the 51st state of Ontario. I'm just returned from Kinshasa, Congo, where I've been spending over the past 10 years a great deal of time. And I'm going to use my past background in matters development, because entrepreneurship is something which is very salient, important in post-conflict countries, because constructive employment is usually with the government, and those are regulated by who you know and if you are friends with the government. And competence is neither necessary nor wanted. And if you were to advise, because I'm at a small university where I do pro bono teaching en français, public administrative law, if you were to advise a young entrepreneur, let's say from Kinshasa, Congo, a state riven but with awesome potential, what would you suggest to these young entrepreneurs? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't been there. I don't have that same experience that you have and that young person would have. I guess there's a few options, assuming they want to continue to stay in, where they are and build a business there. You do have to adapt to your circumstances. I mean, you need to keep to your core values, right? Hopefully those things involve being honest and having integrity. At the same time, I think if you need to do certain things to go kind of, towards the edge, in order to do something that might be very impactful for where you live and beneficial long term, that's something that, maybe you need to consider and be willing to do. Make sure that you're comfortable doing those things as well. If you live in a place where that might be necessary in order to get anything done or to be able to have a business in the first place. That's a very tough situation. There's probably, all the levels of unpredictability that exist with a startup, but then putting it in a place like that, which the nation itself is probably so unpredictable, that only complicates things and makes it probably, even more difficult. So I guess that's, I think, the best advice I could give.
Thank you, Josh. We'll move on to Effie.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And as an avid user of Empower, thank you for building this app. As I live in DC, it was very nice to have an alternative to Uber and Lyft, which I think have kind of overtaken the market in some ways. And my question is, Uber and Lyft, when they first started, also faced a lot of regulatory challenges because at the time, they were kind of disrupting the taxi space. How have you dealt with the regulatory challenges that a startup like Empower is facing in disrupting this new space?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in DC, you've probably seen some of our push notifications and emails and text messages and stuff in the news with respect to all this. I mean, I was expecting pushback. I was not naive to think that wouldn't occur. I was surprised at the level of pushback. And look, at the end of the day, it turns out that the market that I live in, Northern Virginia, DC, I thought would be a bit more amenable for a lot of different reasons to an alternative to Uber and to this business model. It just so happened that from a political standpoint, it's actually probably the most difficult market in the country for a few reasons. One, there really are only 15 elected people in the district. There's 13 council members, the DC Attorney General, and the mayor. And really, only two of those people at the end of the day have substantial power individually, and that's the mayor and the DC Attorney General. So it's much easier for a company like Uber to exert influence over those individuals than it might be in, say, New York City, which has so many different sources of power, right? You've got the state legislature, you've got the city council, you've got borough presidents, you've got comptrollers and all sorts of and unions. There's many more sources of power and regulatory power in a place like New York or in a lot of other cities than there is in DC. And it also just so happens that Uber has very, very close personal and financial relationships with the individuals in power in the district. And so we've faced a lot of opposition. In terms of how we have dealt with it, and I think that context is important to understanding how we're dealing with it. That's why I provided it. But, we from day one made very, very clear we want to work with the district. And we do. We genuinely do. We think that drivers, like every other service professional, be you a barber or a lawyer or an electrician or a construction worker, an accountant, whatever you might be, you should have a right to work for yourself and determine your own worth. And according to the district right now, the only profession where that's not permitted is that of a driver. And I have all sorts of problems with that. I think it's un-American. I think it's terrible, especially given the folks who are in these professions have come from all over the world to find a better life here and to provide for themselves and to have the American dream. And so we've tried from day one to work with folks to achieve that and make sure that that the drivers themselves are regulated and that there are no safety concerns. Any of those things are all addressed, and they all have been, but to also make sure that that's being done by the district to the extent they wish to do so. But at the end of the day, to allow for these folks to be able to work for themselves. And there's just been tremendous pushback on that. They're not interested in that. And so that's we've started to use the political process, and we will increasingly use the political process to affect change. Because at the end of the day, I don't think that the position that DC regulators and the mayor and the attorney general are taking is palatable to the public. I think it's wrong, and I think that voters are going to have a serious problem with it, and we will do everything we can to affect change if necessary at the ballot box. And there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of riders using the platform, tens of thousands of drivers, and this is a serious pocketbook issue for those people, and they're going to vote.
We will take one last question from the chat box. So Josh, you have about 30 seconds.
Sure.
Maybe give a quick response to this. We'll go with Mike's question. It says, he asked, do you feel you were born to eventually be an entrepreneur, or do you feel anyone can be after applying intent, drive, and skilling up appropriately?
I think anyone can do it for sure. I think that, and I don't know that I was born to do it. I will say that I found pretty early on that I did better in smaller, I felt like I'd be better off in a smaller company being a bit bigger fish than a small fish in a big pond. I don't, at least I've gotten better about this, as I've aged, but when I was younger, I certainly had a bit of a contrarian streak and didn't, really accept, oh, this is, the way it is because of the way it is or because I say so. That was never a response that I found very appealing. And so, that might lead someone to be in a better situation where they are working for themselves or working with a small group of people who are like-minded, where they have a little bit more control over their day-to-day. And the answer, well, because I say so, is not one that you have to hear. And so I was always a bit like that. And so I think in that regard, maybe so.
Well, just as I predicted, we have run out of time. Mr. Joshua Sear, thank you for coming to our event today. It has been a pleasure to engage with you in this dynamic conversation. I'm sure that our audience will take away something very special from today's discussion. And to our audience members from all over the world, thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Muska. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Of course.